Good morning and welcome to the Foggy Dew. This is Colin. Well, gang, I got a lot of positive feedback about episode 91. Now, episode 91 was a little bit of a deep dive into the 17th Amendment. And in my opinion, the 17th Amendment drives a lot of the dysfunction that we see in our government today. But really, when you distill that entire conversation about the 17th Amendment, the Apportionment Act of 1929, really what you're talking about is a Federalist position versus an Anti-Federalist position. And I kind of wanted to dovetail on that entire conversation because about a week or so ago, I had been speaking with a listener about the Federalist Papers. And I guess to be more specific, we were actually talking against the Federalist Papers. So just to level set this entire conversation, I have made absolutely no bones about it on the show that I would be an anti-federalist. But it's interesting to me talking to the listener because that listener did not know about the two anti-federalist papers that were written by our founders. And to be clear, the two anti-federalist papers were Brutus and then the Federal Farmer. And it's interesting talking about this entire thing because I'm not really sure why history hides these documents. You don't really see a lot of political science classes, history classes talking about these two anti-federalist papers. And sitting here 250 years post-founding, I guess my suspicion on that runs fairly deep. Because if you look at the drafting of the Constitution, the Federalist position won that battle. However, the Anti-Federalist position won the war. The position of the Anti-Federalists gave you the Bill of Rights. That should be studied more. And if you read Brutus or the Federal Farmer, these two documents are absolutely stunningly brilliant. Those two documents, Brutus, the Federal Farmer, call absolutely everything in our government correctly. And I think they say on the internet, it aged like fine wine. And sitting here as a student of political science, in my opinion at least, the Federalist Papers should be studied equally with Brutus and the Federal Farmer. All three of those things should be looked at by historians. But it's interesting talking about this because either which way, I think most people who have a passing understanding of history or political science know who wrote the Federalist Papers. Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, James Madison, those three founding fathers wrote the 85 essays that comprise the Federalist Papers. Alexander Hamilton was the largest contributor who wrote the Federalist Papers. So I guess if you're looking at it historically, people know those men. I think if you ask most people, they would know Hamilton, Jay, James Madison. But I guess my question is, first of all, do you know that there are anti-federalist papers? And then beyond that, do you know who wrote the dissent to the Federalist Papers? Who wrote Brutus? Who wrote the Federal Farmer? Technically, these essays were anonymous. So historians have had to kind of knit together the style of writing, the thought process. Robert Yates was believed to have written Brutus. Richard Henry Lee was believed to have written the Federal Farmer. But however, there was a strong belief now that one man wrote both of them. That man's name would be Mellington Smith. And that is a name you have probably never heard of, which just blows my mind historically. Yet this man, Mellington Smith, gave you the Bill of Rights. So who was Mellington Smith? Smith was born in New York in 1744. This guy was homeschooled. His family was very, very involved in the mercantile business. So here's Mellington Smith. He was a merchant in New York. Smith was very, very religious. He was interested in metaphysics. This man was integral to the American Revolution. Smith was a member of the New York Provincial Congress. He was also a Minuteman in New York. He served as a New York sheriff. Smith was the guy that tested the allegiance of loyalists. He wanted to identify and mark people that remain loyal to the crown. Because by the colonist perspective, people like that were traitors. But Mellington Smith held a significant legal and military rank in the state of New York. After the war, Smith became a prominent New York merchant. He was on the Continental Congress. The bane of this man's existence was Alexander Hamilton. Mellington Smith absolutely hated Alexander Hamilton. He argued constantly with big government Federalist Alexander Hamilton. And he argued with him so much that his opposition to Hamilton's positions became a legend. Smith was described as, quote, one of the greatest debaters ever in the country, end quote. As the votes started to tumble in for the ratification of the Constitution, Smith realized that the Anti-Federalist position would not win. So what he did, he realized that the Anti-Federalists would lose this battle. So Smith and Patrick Henry were able to get the Bill of Rights added to the Constitution. But historically, what characterized Smith were his writings. Brutus and the Federal Farmer were his magnum opus. They were the opposition. Those were the rebel papers that Smith wrote. I said they were anonymous. Robert Yates was believed to have written Brutus. Richard Henry Lee wrote the Federal Farmer. Over time, analysis shows that both of these documents were written by Mellington Smith. The writing style, the arguments, all point to Smith. Smith would have been the principal author of these two documents in close collaboration with Robert Yates, Patrick Henry, George Mason, and John Hancock, names you probably know well. And I guess just looking at this entire conversation, what I talked about the other day with the 17th Amendment, even talking about this, we as a country have veered so far off of the founders' intent. Because literally, as soon as the ink was dry on the Constitution, big government progressives, Federalists sought to change it. Everything from taxes to the 17th Amendment to the ratio of the House of Representatives, it was all undone over 250 years. But I guess if you sit here and ask yourself, where do you think we would be today if we didn't have a Bill of Rights? Where would we be if we didn't have a Bill of Rights? Mellington Smith gave you the Bill of Rights along with Patrick Henry, and we don't even know who he is. And it's interesting to me, I said my suspicion on this runs deep. It's almost like this knowledge is concealed. And I suppose if you look at it one way, the victors write the history books. But again, talking to that listener the other day that we had this conversation, please read Brutus. Please read The Federal Farmer. And I guess please remember a guy named Mellington Smith, somebody you probably never heard of before you hit play on Spotify or whatever. Mellington Smith was an absolute political genius who saw the future very clearly. He warned us what would happen. Nobody remembers him, but guess what? Mellington Smith was right. So thank you, Mellington Smith, for everything you left for us. So switching gears, a guy that I don't talk about enough on the show is a guy named Brandon Johnson. Now, if you don't know that name, Brandon Johnson is the inept mayor of Chicago. And if you look at Chicago, Chicago is a lot like downtown St. Louis. Decades and decades of inept, clueless Democrat leaders. But if you look at who is on the Mount Rushmore of inept Democrat leaders, Johnson would be one of the main guys. He just takes the cake. Brandon Johnson makes Lori Lightfoot look like George Washington. And quite frankly, I was writing this whole thing about Johnson. I'm almost convinced that people like Brandon Johnson are installed to accelerate decline, just to overwhelm the system, to just blow it out. But I had to laugh because I saw this article pop up the other day about Chicago, and it just made me laugh out loud. The leaders in Chicago have ideas, so just brace yourself. So Chicago wants more tourism. The Brain Trust in Chicago has noticed that tourism is declining. And I guess that's probably a shocking revelation to realize that tourism is declining in the city of Chicago. I mean, I guess it escapes their notice that people don't want to travel to dangerous, dirty places riddled with crime. Going to a place like Chicago is like volunteering to get mugged or shot. Mogadishu looks idyllic in comparison to Chicago. So, with tourism down, how does the Chicago Brain Trust plan on growing tourism? What's their master plan here? Well, the wise elders of the Chicago City Council have decided that they're going to raise taxes. They're going to raise taxes to fund tourism marketing efforts. They want more money to make Chicago attractive to tourists. So I'm with you guys. I'm following along. How do they plan on raising taxes? How are they going to fund their tourism marketing? What they decided to do is to raise taxes on hotel rooms. That's right. They want to put a higher tax on hotel rooms. So, to be totally clear, this is the logical progression here. They want to raise taxes on hotel rooms, which would then be used by the same tourists that you are trying to attract. So, the plan to fund tourism is to make tourism more expensive. It's like free barbells on a snorkeling trip. It's like putting shattered glass on the ground at a barefoot walking competition. Yeah, please come to Chicago. We've not only made it insanely dangerous, now it's going to cost you more to stay here. Come to Chicago. We've made your death more expensive. But Bartertown thinks that's a bad idea. I love it. Keep it up, Chicago. Great stuff. And to be fair, I said I was reading this thing. I'm like, we need that type of luminosity at the federal level. We shouldn't just keep those brilliant people just in one place in Chicago. We really need that federal level. We need just these brilliant luminaries up in DC to help them with their plans. Keep it up, guys. You're doing great. You're making me laugh. So, switching gears, I've talked enough about the SAVE Act on the show. But another fact dropped on Monday, another breadcrumb for you to think about. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments on Monday. They heard arguments about Election Day. Now, it's interesting because in 29 states, ballots are counted well beyond Election Day. In 29 states. Counting mail-in ballots for weeks after an election. Now, my takeaway on this is that the Supreme Court is going to rule that ballots must be counted on Election Day. This idea of unsecured mail-in balloting going on for weeks after Election Day is a total fraud. It is a total fraud, and you don't need to look much further than Arizona. Arizona counts all their ballots on Election Day, and then all of a sudden the counting stops, and then you just have this treasure trove of mail-in ballots that keep trickling in that gives the desired result of a Democrat winning. It's a total scam. But if you look at the Supreme Court argument itself, I listened to most of the oral arguments. The oral arguments and the comments given by the justices were very much pro-Election Day, meaning we have a day, not weeks. What that would mean is that 29 states would have their election laws changed. If you're asking me, this case is going to go 6-3 to cap vote counting and have an election day, not an election week, not an election month. And it's interesting looking at the polling on this issue. Again, the polling on all this stuff, when you look at election integrity, is so lopsided. 83% of voters support having an election day. Now, this decision on Election Day is going to come in June. So again, I talked about breadcrumbs. This is yet another fraud center for mail-in balloting and all this other stuff. The Democrat fraud scheme is collapsing here. And quite frankly, there's Republicans that do this too. I don't think in any way, shape, or form a person like Lisa Murkowski is really lauded up in a place like Alaska, which is like ruby red. But again, having the Supreme Court address this issue is having yet another pillar of fraud removed from our voting. It's just amazing sitting here. We're supposed to be America, the best country on the planet. We've got bogus, unchecked voter rolls. We've got mail-in balloting, ballot curing, ballot harvesting. You got places like California that you're not even allowed to show an ID to vote. You've got elections going on for weeks. I mean, anybody with two brain cells to rub together knows that's a scam. Look, and again, I just mentioned Arizona. Allowing mail-in ballots to trickle in weeks later with no ID attached to it is obvious fraud. And I guess you don't have to look much further than Pennsylvania in 2020, this exact thing happened. The Pennsylvania Constitution said very plainly that ballots must be received by Election Day. Well, what happened is that they didn't call the election in Pennsylvania for like a week after in 2020. And then there was an argument, there was a lawsuit that said that all these ballots that arrived after Election Day should be thrown out. Well, the crazy thing, and again, this was 6 years ago, so people don't really think about it or remember it, but the Pennsylvania Supreme Court allowed that law to be broken because of COVID. It was like 300,000 or 400,000 votes that came in that were technically illegal. And 300,000 or 400,000 votes is enough votes to tip the election. But I guess back away from this whole situation about election day, not election week, not election month. This is pattern recognition. If you look at all the breadcrumbs in the media, drip, drip, drip. This whole thing about election day is another marker in the election fraud scam. And if you're asking me, I think we're getting close here. And I don't think we're just getting close to securing elections, meaning like citizenship to vote, no mail-in balloting, election day now month, secure election. I think we're close to understanding what happened in 2020. I think anybody with a functioning brain at this point, or if you're anyway conservative, knows that 2020 was a scam. But I think it's going to be confirmed that 2020 was totally rigged and stolen. And to be fair, all signs, if you're being honest, point to this. Russiagate, COVID, 2020 election. They couldn't let Trump win for some reason. And I think this whole thing is why they hate Trump. I think it was all a coup that started with Russiagate. Remember, it's called a grand conspiracy. That's what the Florida grand jury is looking at. And I mean, even if you just want to look at just the voting part of it, Barack Obama, at the height of his powers, got 65 million votes. Joe Biden, the cadaver that did not campaign at all, Biden won less counties than Obama did. Joe Biden won less counties than Obama, but somehow got 16 million more votes. So somehow 2 New York cities popped up in the counties that Joe Biden did win. 16 million more people appeared out of the ether to vote for Joe Biden, the cadaver. The numbers are just absolutely preposterous when you look at Joe Biden. Go look at any election history. The Joe Biden thing is such a crazy outlier, it doesn't even make sense. And the funny thing about it is they called it, quote, the big lie. Remember this? The media just, anytime you hear a slogan, your antenna should go up. The big lie, the big lie, the big lie. The big lie was that 2020 was stolen. And I think what you're seeing is the puzzle pieces being arranged where you're going to learn that it was actually the big truth. Drip, drip, drip. We're going to see, man. But I'm telling you, in June, this thing's going to drop, and we're going to have election day. We're not going to know the tally and then let people just count mail-in ballots as long as they want till their candidate wins. Good. Looking forward to hearing the decision from the Supreme Court. More to come. So, switching gears, I talk a lot on the show about how California is just a dumpster fire, how capital is just fleeing the state of California. Well, new IRS data just dropped to prove my point. And this is just fascinating stuff here. So here is net migration data from 2023. And if you look, this is 2023. We don't even have the numbers for the last couple of years. These numbers are going to get worse for 24 through 26, but here you go. So this is from the IRS. Red states in 2023 gained $37.2 billion in income. Red states got 492,000 new filers. Curious about blue states? Blue states lost $40.8 billion in income. 520,000 less filers in blue states. The net on that? The net is that red gained $78 billion in income. Red gained $78 billion in new income. Blue lost $40.8 billion. $40.8 billion. Man, that's a spicy meatball to lose. Curious about the individual states? I sure am. California lost $11.9 billion. New York lost $9.9 billion. Illinois, with my buddy Brandon Johnson and his buddy Pritzker, Illinois lost $6 billion. Massachusetts lost $4.2 billion. New Jersey with its $3 billion structural deficit, New Jersey lost $2.8 billion. Curious about red? That's the counterpoint, right? Florida gained $20.6 billion. Texas gained $5.3 billion. South Carolina, $4.1 billion. North Carolina, $2.7 billion. Florida, can you believe that Florida gained 20.6, California lost 11.9. This just goes on and on. And look, I'm not a rocket scientist, but people vote with their feet and with their pocketbook. Capital and investment are flowing red. Why? Lower taxes, less regulation. You even see with people like Mark Zuckerberg, even communists like Mark Zuckerberg flee when the tax bill comes due. And just wait. I've talked about Virginia on this show before. Wait till the data comes out from Virginia. Abigail Spanberger, who ran as a moderate talking about affordability, these people and these policies are chasing people away. And I guess the long-term danger here, when you see people voting with their feet, is that these people that are fleeing the communist hellholes that they created, that those people bring their voting habits to places like Florida, places like Texas. And I guess there's got to be a way to fix that. I don't know how there is. But if you flee California for Texas or Florida, hey, here's an idea. Do all of us a favor and don't vote blue anymore. Blue policies caused your flight. Don't double down on silly. Just looking at this data, this is 2023, so this is post-COVID. And I said it just a minute ago. This data is going to get worse. And I had to laugh because I saw this in the news the other day. So here's New York losing $9.9 billion in income, and here's old Comrade Kathy Hochul. Comrade Kathy, the communist comrade who runs New York State. Comrade Kathy does an interview with Politico last week. She starts begging wealthy people to come back. Here's Kathy Hochul. Quote, I need people who are high net worth to support the generous social programs that we want to have in our state. Now, there are some patriotic millionaires who stepped up. Okay, cut me the checks if you want to be supportive, but maybe the first step should be go down to Palm Beach and see who you can bring back home. There were people who could only work in an office in Manhattan and work in New York State, and they were captives to our state. They were going to stay. We saw that's not the case. Wall Street businesses looking at Texas, they're not going there because they have a nicer governor. They're going there because of the tax rate, end quote. This person's a governor. This person is someone thought it was a good idea on a ballot to vote for this person. I love this. I need people who are high net worth to support the generous social programs that we want to have in our state. How about you don't have those programs and maybe you lower taxes? It's just beautiful. Old comrade Kathy, I guess she goose-stepped past her economics class in college. It's just unbelievable to me. You have all these businesses fleeing, high net worth individuals are leaving, the tax base is totally eroded and blue, and I guess, newsflash to everybody, the exodus will continue. And I guess red is winning the argument. But I love seeing these little like breadcrumbs of like this whole, the argument is so ridiculous. The states were meant to be the laboratory of democracy. That was truly the founders' intent. You're seeing the laboratory experiment being conducted right now, and red is winning. But trust me, I'll be watching all of it. So, switching gears, I had talked before about how Iran was a China proxy war. And I think everything that we're seeing right now is about China. And I saw a bunch of data about China operating in our hemisphere that would prove my point. Now, when you look at Latin American countries in this hemisphere, all of these countries are going all in on right-wing populism. And it's interesting watching just two facts. USAID money was shut off. And then the second point would be that China is being booted out of this hemisphere. And I've talked about it on the show before, but China, and I guess BRICS, if you want to look at it that way, China and BRICS were operating very heavily in this hemisphere. Here's some crazy numbers. I saw this come out and I wanted to go ahead and pass it along. Since 2005, China has invested $120 billion into Latin American countries. China invested $120 billion into Latin American countries in the last 20 years. Venezuela in that time frame got $60 billion from China. China pumped $60 billion into Venezuela. I want you to think about it this way. Venezuela was the forward outpost for China's energy plans moving forward. Oil, mining. That was the Chinese investment into Venezuela. China had other interests in Venezuela. Rare earth, lithium, tin, gold. All of those things, the oil, the rare earth, the lithium, all that, all of those now are under U.S. supervision. China wanted a forward operating base in this hemisphere, basically in a proxy state called Venezuela. Well, good news for American citizens, China has no access to Venezuelan oil or mining now. Zoom the scope back. China just didn't invest $120 billion. They actually had $130 billion in infrastructure investments there on top of everything else. So $120 million flowing into the governments, $120 billion flowing into the governments, $130 billion in infrastructure investments. Are you ready for this? China was doing $518 billion in trade with Latin America. $120 billion, $130 billion infrastructure, $518 billion in trade with Latin America. Look, I'm not an economics professor, but China was buying Latin America. And if you look at it this way, this was their Belt and Road in this hemisphere. So Donald Trump, in one swift move, black bags Maduro, and Venezuela is essentially knocked out for China. Well, what was the bouncing ball of logic beyond that? Cuba. Cuba was supplied by China through Venezuela. And if you think about Venezuela as China's forward operating base for energy, think about Cuba is China's forward base for spying. China had four bases in Cuba for intelligence gathering. China owned Cuba's telecoms. Do you know how dangerous? Cuba is like 80, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So China was using Cuba as a spy satellite for US operations. So again, zoom it in, Trump bags Venezuela, China loses its energy base. Well, without Venezuelan energy, Cuba goes on life support. But I guess broadly, if you look at these two things, China is losing its forward operating bases. Venezuela and Cuba were proxies of China, no more. Trump severed the umbilical cord here. Now, zoom back again. Zoom back away from Venezuela and Cuba. Latin American countries are not stupid. These Latin American countries saw that occur. They see which way the wind is blowing in this hemisphere. This whole situation fuels the switch to right-wing populism. It fuels an alignment to the United States. And what I would tell you is more broadly is China is neutered in this hemisphere. 130 billion in infrastructure gone, 120 billion in China loans gone, 518 billion in trade, poof. Now what I hope happens is that I think after Cuba falls, I think Brazil is next. Brazil is shifting too. I have not talked about Brazil much on the show, but Brazil, if you look at Brazil over the last few years, Brazil was basically taken over by pro-China globalists. And the guy that's installed as the president right now, Lula is a socialist that was installed over Bolsonaro, who was basically the Brazilian Trump. Bolsonaro, again, the Brazilian Trump, was taken out by a rogue judge. That rogue judge was Moraes. Well, Moraes, and this guy, you've probably seen him on the internet. He looks like a comic book villain, but Moraes is actually under investigation now. He's under criminal investigation, the judge that took out the Brazilian Trump. Lula is losing support hand over fist, and Bolsonaro's son is leading in the polls. Brazil is a huge, huge chess beast if you look at the entire global picture. But I guess just either which way you want to look at this, the data that is now coming out about China in this hemisphere is insane. China and BRICS were very, very, very busy over here. They were working while we were sleeping. We were talking about DEI, and they were doing Belt and Road initiatives in our backyard. But again, I guess the point of this is that if you look at anything Trump does, from Venezuela to Cuba to Iran, any of it, it's all about China. China. I just look at all this stuff. Russiagate, 2020, COVID. COVID came from China. Anyway, it's just crazy to me. I just cannot. Then I saw these numbers coming out. That is they had like $1 trillion that was flowing in business in our hemisphere, in our backyard. And we're worried about woke. We're worried about DEI, all these silly things, while they're overtaking us on the global stage. Thank God for Donald Trump seeing all this and cutting it off. Great job, Donald Trump, but I'll be watching all of it. So switching gears, I've been watching the Artemis program very closely. And just to kind of level set, Artemis is the crewed mission that's going to go around the moon. And this will be the first time men will go around the moon in 50 years. I've talked about this Artemis program in the show before. In February, a launch was scrubbed. And then in March, a launch was scrubbed. So the next dates for launch are actually going to be in early April. Now, the moon has to align here. The telemetry has to be right for them to proceed with the launch. So the dates that NASA is looking at is April 1st, April 2nd, April 3rd, 4th, 5th, or 6th. Now, if any of those don't work, they're going to have to push it back till April 30th. But I guess just if you look at this whole thing, I am so excited for this launch. And I guess not only is man going around the moon, but Artemis is going to set the stage for man to actually go on the moon. Not just man landing on the moon, but man living on it. So What am I talking about? Well, on Tuesday, very big news broke. Now, the head of NASA is a guy named Jared Isaacman. Well, Isaacman had a press conference. Isaacman, the head of NASA, announced very, very big plans for the moon. NASA's plan that they just revealed is for the United States to establish a permanent base on the moon. How unreal is this? So there's going to be 3 phases to this. The first phase is going to be rover and tech deployment to the moon. The second phase is going to be semi-habitable infrastructure built with tech payloads. The third phase, permanent human habitats. This just blows my mind. Isaacman's quote, humanity's first permanent surface outpost beyond Earth, end quote. If you're curious on the financials, NASA has $20 billion planned over 7 years. Man, this blows my mind. We are living in a sci-fi novel. And I kind of dove into some of the plans. Basically, phase 1, I talked about it. Their plan there is to drop raw materials and then AI on the surface. The AI will build solar panels. Those solar panels will capture sunlight and feed the AI. Well, AI, machines, robots, etc., will build and grow the base. AI will make it suitable for humans. This is basically Elon Musk's plans for Mars. So they want to start doing landings at the lunar South Pole, and those landings will start in 2027. So NASA will have monthly landings of material on the lunar South Pole in 2027. And I guess you might be sitting there going, what are you talking about AI building this? You can watch it all the time. It's on like 60 Minutes or any of these news shows. You see these like AI robots in car factories. It's the same deal. It's tactile AI-driven builders. And they're not like human-like. Some of them might be, but a lot of these will be different machines that are fed by AI. I just think it's so amazing. So you'll have AI builders fed and powered by radiant energy from the sun. Amazing job, NASA. And I haven't talked about it on the show before, but long term, this entire project is going to fuel what they're calling the moon driver. Now, the moon driver is basically a catapult. It's like a slingshot. So what'll happen once they have this base on the moon, AI robots will mine the moon. They will mine the moon for raw material. They'll take that raw material, nickel, iron, lithium, whatever it is, they'll load those raw materials onto a capsule. That capsule will then be loaded onto a catapult. Well, so here you have this thing, it's called a mass driver, it's basically like a catapult. Well, since the moon has such low gravity, you don't need accelerant like you do on Earth. You don't need these huge jet packs or whatever. You don't need rocket fuel. You basically point the capsule and the raw material at the Earth and then fire it back into space where it traverses its way to the Earth. So they're basically firing all these raw materials back to the Earth where Space Force can collect the material or it can just crash land in the ocean and we can retrieve it. But that's called the moon driver. That's the future. I just think it's so interesting looking at all the plans that they have for the moon because AI is going to eventually be able to repair itself. AI will be able to correct its own tactile issues. AI will build its own needs on the moon. Anyway, I just thought it was so interesting. I wanted to pass it along. That's huge news. We're going to start dumping material on the moon in 2027. Men on the moon, going around moon in Artemis. The moon driver. Man, it's like a sci-fi novel come to life. Anyway, I think it's so amazing. And if you have kids, I would tell them to be watching this stuff. My son is in high school and he's just like constantly telling me stuff about it. I think it's so interesting, but we'll be watching it. So switching gears, I kind of wanted to give kind of a fun story to end the week off with. So I have this story about the Lovat clan that I've been sitting on for a while. Now, what is the Lovat clan? The Lovat clan was actually a Scottish clan, and I guess technically it's Clan Fraser of Lovat. But this particular story is about a guy named Simon Fraser. Well, Simon Fraser was the 11th Lord Lovat. The family lands were around Inverness in Scotland. That is the Lovat. So Lovat is the land, Fraser is the surname. So this particular Simon Fraser lived from 1667 to 1747. Now, Fraser was a Jacobite. Well, what was a Jacobite? A Jacobite was a political ideology. Jacobites believed that the Stuart court, that's S-T-U-A-R-T, Jacobites believed that the Stuart court was the rightful king of England. Now, the Stuart family had actually lost the crown, but there were many people in Ireland, in Scotland, and in the UK that believed that the Stuart claim to the throne was legitimate. So Simon Fraser was one of these people. And it's almost like Game of Thrones. Back in those times, titles were fought for. So the Stuart court, when it was out of power, began to marshal its allies. It wanted to marshal its allies to take the crown back by force. Now, there were several uprisings by the Stuarts and by their followers, the Jacobites. The first Jacobite uprising was in 1715. Now, that first Jacobite rebellion in 715 failed to get the Stuarts back into power. And what happened was that the Stuart family then was exiled from England. Well, Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, had openly supported the Stuart claim. Well, as the Stuarts were exiled after the first uprising, Fraser kept communicating with them. So Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, is communicating with rebels. What happened was that the Stuart ambition for the crown never stopped. The Stuart family was utterly convinced in its claim. And why is Lord Lovat doing this? Why is Simon Fraser doing this? The family stood to gain land and title promised to them by the Stuarts. Well, this whole rebellious thread of the Stuart family culminated 30 years later in 1745. The Jacobites and the Stuart court had a second uprising in 1745. Simon Fraser supplied arms and monies to the rebel Stuart family. Well, of course, Fraser, by supplying arms to a rebel, became a rebel himself. Ultimately, Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, was captured as a rebel to the crown. He was captured in the second Jacobite uprising. I just said it. He's a traitor to the crown. He was captured and he was sent to London Tower. He's held in London Tower as a traitor, high treason to the crown. Well, his trial then at that point is a complete sham. Well, Simon Fraser is then sentenced to death. His actual sentence was hanging, and then he would be drawn and quartered. Well, this penalty was reduced to a simple beheading. Simon Fraser, the 11th Lord Lovat, was beheaded on April 9th, 1747. Now, the execution of Simon Fraser at this time was noteworthy for a couple reasons. First of which is that this was the last beheading ever ordered by the British Crown. So this is the last beheading ever in England. Well, the second noteworthy thing about this beheading, as Simon Fraser was being put in his guillotine, something happened. So this man had his head stuck in a guillotine, the blade is above his neck, and as everybody's sitting there watching this, a timber stand nearby collapsed. Well, there were all these spectators that were standing on this timber stand. So this timber stand collapsed and it kills 9 spectators. So in the middle of this execution, there's this total scene. Well, Simon Fraser's got his head in a guillotine and he sees all these people that are kind of morbidly watching his own execution. Well, he starts laughing at them. He's laughing that these people fell and hurt themselves. He was still laughing when the blade fell. That situation is the origin of the phrase, quote, laughing your head off. So that is the story of the 11th Lord Lovat. Now, the Lovat clan has more history. Simon Fraser, the 15th Lord Lovat, also has a story. So Simon Fraser, the 15th Lord Lovat, was born in 1911. This Simon Fraser became a cavalry officer. He was actually a supplemental officer in the British Army. Well, in 1939, he was actually mobilized as a captain in the Lovat Scouts. Well, what were the Lovat Scouts? The Lovat Scouts were actually commandos. These guys were special operations. They used to wear ghillie suits. They practiced unorthodox fighting styles. The Lovat Scouts were all volunteers, and they became World War II shock fighters. Winston Churchill actually had to sign off on this unit personally. So you've got Simon Fraser and the Lovat Scouts. These men, these commandos, would attack German positions and depots, clandestine operations. They would do seek and destroy. At one point, they seized an encryption facility. They would do assassinations. Obviously, if you're doing all this commando work, the Lovat Scouts became feared by the German army. And Hitler himself actually knew of the Lovat Scouts. Hitler personally ordered a 100,000 Reichsmark bounty on this Simon Fraser's head. Hitler, because of these guys' activity, actually issued a thing called the Commando Order. Well, what is the Commando Order that Hitler issued? This was a summary execution of all commandos caught in wartime activities. Well, Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat 15, was a total military legend. Well, as 1944 approached, planning began for Operation Overlord. That's the Normandy landings. Simon Fraser at that point had been promoted to brigadier. Well, his brigade actually landed at Sword Beach on D-Day. Fraser was actually depicted in the movie The Longest Day. Fraser waded ashore at Normandy Beach in full battle dress. And it's interesting because Fraser actually had a personal piper with him. He had a piper named Bill Millen with him when he landed at D-Day. Lord Lovat, Simon Fraser, instructed Bill Millen to play his pipes as they landed on Normandy Beach on D-Day. Now, it's interesting because the British War Office had actually forbidden this from occurring. They did not want pipes being played in combat. Well, Bill Millen, the piper, told Simon Fraser of the British Army's rule on piping. Lord Lovat told Bill Millen, quote, but that is the English War Department. We are Scottish. That doesn't apply. So Lord Lovat advanced across Sword. The group of commandos that he was with penetrated inwards and captured Pegasus Bridge, which was an important objective of the Allies. Well, a few days later, Simon Fraser was seriously injured. This hero survived the war and died in 1985. Now, it's interesting with the Frasers landing on Normandy Beach on D-Day because the clan could actually trace their heritage all the way back to Normandy. So his landing on Normandy Beach was seen as a symbolic full circle moment for the family. Now, beyond the family connections to Normandy, that was actually the last time that a Scottish clan chief commanded troops in war. That was also the last time a Scottish clan chief marched into war with a piper. But his actions on D-Day recalled the ancient traditions of Scottish clan warfare, a theatrical demonstration of ancient Scottish clan history. You want to talk about full circle moment for the family? At Simon Fraser, the 15th Lord Lovat's funeral, his son played the bagpipes. I just thought it was an interesting story. It's so fascinating to me how there's like these threads of history and families are intertwined in it. But anyway, I thought it was a good way to end the week. So hopefully you enjoyed that little story. So if you like this show, please go ahead and tell a friend about it. If you would, please follow us on Spotify. You can also follow us on Instagram at Foggy Dew Daily. If you have questions for the show, please go ahead and email us at foggydew95@gmail.com. But in the meantime, I'd ask you to say a prayer, ask questions, and stay vigilant. This is the Foggy Dew signing off.